Alright. Well, this is my review for the week, and to do my final video for the week of 4th of July, I am reviewing the Mel Gibson. Well, you already know because of the title card that I got off Google Images. Let me just move this a little closer, and yeah, so this, before I get into my actual review on whether I think the movie was good, bad, or mediocre, I just want to say this is one of those movies that I had never sat down and seen all the way through. Much like Titanic, I'd seen so much of it, I pretty much have seen the whole film without one sitting. And even then, I fell asleep when I was watching this movie on the night of 4th of July. But the part I fell asleep was right before the final battle of the movie. So I had already seen that whole part and the ending. So I pretty much fell asleep right before familiar territory. So that's fine. And I've seen enough people talking about this movie, and I pretty much know the whole film. So this might be a fine line, but I think I'm ready to review it. And since this movie is probably not as well known as other war films or other movies about American history, I'll give you guys the skinny. So The Patriot stars Mel Gibson as Benjamin Martin, this humble farmer in South Carolina who has a traumatic war history past of him being a war hero and probably one of the most violent soldiers of all time. But now he's a family man until his son comes back from the Revolutionary War, injured, and Mel Gibson decides to join the fight after he's tending to American soldiers on his homeland, on his farm, and then the British come, try to take Heath Ledger, Benjamin's son in the war, take him prisoner. Gabriel's brother Thomas tries to free Gabriel, but gets shot by one of the British officers who refers to him as a stupid boy, while Mel Gibson is grieving over his son's body. And that is basically the breaking point, because throughout the movie, at that point, Mel Gibson has repeatedly insisted, no, I am not fighting, I am not fighting, I am not fighting. There's got to be another way to get our point across without fighting. And this movie takes place in 1776, so the Declaration of Independence has already been signed, the Revolutionary War is already well underway, so tensions are pretty high. And a lot of my knowledge about the historical stuff on this movie comes from a movie review done by History Buffs, which, if you look him up on YouTube, he's done a lot of great videos. But I think this kind of leads to one of my first problems with the movie, is that the movie doesn't really explain very well what all the reasons were for America for America being involved in a war with England. I mean, they do mention taxation without representation. That was one of the reasons. They mention the fact that they're tired of being run by the king, who's an ocean away from them. But what they don't mention is the British soldiers invading their privacy for asking for quarters. They don't mention... I mean, they mention taxation without representation, but they don't mention what it's about, necessarily. They don't reference the Boston Tea Party. There's a bunch of stuff in the movie. There's a bunch of historical events that led up to the war that they just kind of skim over a few of the reasons, but they don't really necessarily go into it as much. And they also don't explain that the British were saying you cannot cross this boundary from the colonies out west to find new land. So with the taxation, invasion of privacy from the British soldiers, and that was part of it, and also the threat of not being able to move beyond the boundary to see what's out west, that and a lot of other reasons is ultimately what pushed Americans to break free. And they also never mention the reason why they're being taxed without being represented. Because this is after the French and Indian War, and what happened was Since the British Army was fighting to represent the colonies at the time, it put them in a huge debt, and they figured that the colonists should help pay with the bill, and that's why all the taxes were being thrown. But the taxes were largely ignored, and then it just got to a point where it really heated up. So the movie, it could have done a little bit of a better job explaining what pushed us to go to war. And there are some other problems I have with it, like Heath Ledger's explanation to go. For one thing, it kind of comes out of nowhere. He just randomly decides he wants to join the fight, and you do kind of get the sense it's the idea of him wanting to be a war hero and not really knowing what war really entails. But I don't know. It's hard for me to decide whether I get behind. I understand why you'd want to fight for your freedom, but I kind of feel like Ledger is only really doing it because the script is telling him to, and it creates drama between him and his father, who is a war vet and doesn't want to have his son go through the things he saw, and he doesn't want his son to die. You know? So, yeah, and another scene that I personally have... There are a few other things I have problems with. I mean, there are some good parts of the movie that I do really enjoy, but there's a lot of negative stuff I want to get through. This movie's kind of a mixed bag. So when Heath Ledger gets kidnapped by the British right in front of Benjamin Martin, he and a few of his sons get some weapons and hunt down the platoon that has Gabriel captive, and they start killing them all off one by one. Major problem here. How is a man and two preteens supposed to fight off a squad of highly trained soldiers? I can understand taking out a few of the soldiers and getting away with it, but killing off all like 20, 30 people just to get their son back, that seems a little ridiculous. And another problem I have with that scene is that this is right after Benjamin Martin's son got shot right in front of him and gets killed. So I can understand why he'd be violently murdering all the British soldiers, especially one part where he has like a tomahawk and he starts hacking this guy to bits. I don't mind that, but the scene drags on for so long. It's like, okay, we get the point. It's supposed to be bloody and violent. He's angry. We got the hint. Can you just cut already? It just seemed like overkill in my mind. And again, it's very unrealistic that one man and two children could take on a group of soldiers and not get hurt at all. That was pretty stupid. I think the last scene that I can really laugh at is a scene where Gabriel Martin goes back to the war. Mel Gibson follows him. They see a fight going on out in the fields, and there's a weird shot of a cannon. We follow this cannonball zooming around the field, and it takes a soldier's head off. And I don't think that was meant to be funny. It seemed like some sort of gory Looney Tunes skit of a skirmish in Revolutionary War era America. That just seemed really cartoony. I mean, the movie is really cartoony when you think about it in some scenes, like the way they portray the British as, well, they portray Tavington as this irredeemable monster. But then again, I don't think this movie is trying to be historical fiction, so I'm not sure how much accuracy you should really be holding this film to as far as standards go. But yeah, it does get a little heavy-handed with its message. The one last scene I have to make that I can make fun of, well, I think there's two scenes. One is the scene where the villain Tavington burns down an entire church with civilians inside. That never happened in the entire conflict. And I know this because I researched this, and this scene was actually based off something that happened in World War II, so it's like, yeah, this wouldn't happen for another 160 odd years. Or like 165, whatever. It didn't happen at that point. they're doing something that was based off something that happened in the early, I think it was in 1942 when that actual thing. It's weird. So I think that's probably the one scene where they went a little too far with demonizing the British. It's kind of like how in Pearl Harbor they had the Japanese fighter pilots shooting at civilians in hospitals during the Pearl Harbor attack, even though it was reported that they never took a clear shot at anyone that wasn't fighting them. And American soldiers and even Americans and Japanese, both sides of that conflict were really angry because they were just pissed off at the misrepresentation. And I can imagine that a lot of British people watching this movie were probably, I think they were probably along with the one-note villains until that scene, which they probably got really inflamed at. I think another scene that I find kind of stupid because of the Americana behind it is the scene where Benjamin Martin is running after Tavington in a head-on collision with the American flag, and he stabs the horse. I mean, I know it's supposed to be symbolic of a bunch of colonists taking down a major empire, but Mel Gibson's face looks like he's trying to hold back a fart, and the whole scene is so ridiculous that it's supposed to be a dramatic scene, but it just looks really cheesy and silly. And that's really all the negative things I'd have to say. And I spent about 12 minutes bitching about the movie. The good part in it is that Mel Gibson, he gives another good performance. And it is kind of a cool father-son story. Even though Ledger's character does eventually get killed, you do kind of get the sense that being in a war together does kind of help strengthen their relationship, and it does kind of prove to Mel Gibson's character that Heath Ledger is now more of a man than he ever was. And as much as I complain about the movie being cheesy, it is kind of inspirational, especially when Mel Gibson almost quits and then comes back for the final hurrah to save the day. That's actually a very awe-inspiring scene. And the scene where he has the flag and he's waving it in these old ruins on the open field, that's actually some pretty awesome imagery. But then it got torpedoed by the climactic fight. But you have your main hero and the main villain. You kind of have to go that way. I'm trying to think what else. Actually, most of the acting is really good. The writing is a little hokey and simplistic, but it's not that bad. I would say if you're gonna watch this movie, watch it as historical fiction. If you try to watch it as based on a true, I mean, this is based on real history, but it's kind of like how Master and Commander takes pages from actual history, but isn't an actual story. If you know what I mean, because I think this movie is a little closer to being historically accurate in terms of real. Yeah. Anyways, I do think that this movie, it's a good movie to watch. As much as I bitched about it, I will say this: it is a good movie, but it's kind of like a Michael Bay historical film in the sense that, it's like Pearl Harbor in the sense that the movie kind of knows what it's talking about, but even if you're a history buff or not, you can kind of tell they're not really balancing the facts out as well as they could. But it's actually it is a very violent film. So if you're not someone that is okay with a lot of blood, I would not watch this. But I would say if you wanted to watch this, there's no real harm in it. But just try not to take it too seriously. It's very engaging and entertaining, but it's flawed and kind of goofy at times. There are some scenes in there that are meant to be comedic, like the scene where they blow up a British warship and someone thinks it's fireworks. There are some scenes that are legitimately funny, and it actually doesn't do a bad job at balancing out goofiness and harsh truths. But I don't know. I feel like I don't know. I kind of feel like this was a more upbeat version of Braveheart because Mel Gibson doesn't die at the end. I mean, he makes it out okay. But I'm really just rambling. If you haven't seen this movie, I would say definitely check it out, but don't expect anything. Don't expect it to be a cross between the quality of Pearl Harbor and the quality of Glory or something like that. Expect it to be somewhere in between really good like Glory and kind of stupid like Pearl Harbor. Anyway, I will be posting my cover for Bad for Good on Monday, and I will be reviewing Toy Story 4 this upcoming week. See ya.